Hey everyone, welcome to another video session that we'll do with Andy DuBois of Mile27. Andy is probably one of Australasia's, if not the best Australasian running coach when it comes to understanding running power and its applicability to runners and trail runners. And I wanted to bring him on and just have a chat with him for 45 minutes or so about running power, how it's applicable to trail runners, and how we can all benefit from using it. So Andy, perhaps an introduction and a little bit about yourself and who you are and your history and power running.
Thanks, Kerry. Good to be here. Yeah, as Kerry said, I am head coach at Mile27. I coach a number of athletes all around the world, and probably 60% of my clients are using power meters now. I joined on board with a power probably 5-6 years ago. At that stage, it was a chest strap you wore attached to your heart rate monitor, and since then it's moved to the foot pod that most people are familiar with now. So yeah, early days with power, it was more a case of just seeing whether we could use it for trail runners. So I tested it out for myself and thought, okay, I think there's some benefits here. I think it can be used. And I started using it with some clients. And probably after about a year and a half of testing with kind of 10 athletes, just kind of seeing what the data was like, I was confident enough that we could actually say, yep, this is good for trail and ultra runners. And since then, yeah, it's grown to kind of 60 plus athletes all using power for races ranging from UTA, UTMB, and everything in between. I've worked with Stride, although I have no financial affiliation with Stride. It's completely separate. But yeah, those of you who have kind of got onto Stride will know that Stride now separate their power into uphill, downhill, flat, and hiking. That was through suggestions of mine in terms of how to split that apart. So they've been good in trying to come on board with kind of trail and ultra runners, kind of asking me, what do we need and how can we best serve you? So I have no affiliation with them, but just to put it out there that I have worked with them in trying to develop a product that's more usable for trail and ultra runners rather than just the road users, because trail and ultras have a different kind of demand and a different use than just standard road runners would have.
Yeah, so it's pretty accessible technology now. I think, Ali, I left in your office a couple of devices that we happen to have in the house that can record power in some way. So what have you got there, Ali?
Oh, it's a bit wet.
Yeah. So the Garmin HRM Run, which has the built-in running dynamics pod, is Garmin's ability to record that. What is it, force times mass now, provided you have your mass accurate. And that's I think one of the previous versions of the Stride foot pod, which I use. And I know that Coros has it built into a lot of their watches now, the Apex and probably all of their future trail running watches. The hard thing I think with Coros is that, as any of the users will tell you, they'll never have a chance to tell you about running power because they're so busy telling you about their battery life.
I think it's important to just kind of tell people the differences between the different foot pods and power meters. You've got two essential types. One's based on accelerometers and one's based on GPS. So your GPS ones are like Coros, it uses GPS. Now, the problem with that, of course, if you haven't got a good GPS signal, then you don't have good power data, simple as that. The other problem with a GPS-based power system is that if you have two runners both running the same pace up a hill, for example, then power is going to be the same. So there's going to be no difference, because if it's GPS-based, it can only be based on speed, not any individual variations of a runner's biomechanics. So whereas if you have a foot pod, you can have two runners running the same pace and power numbers can be different even if their weight's exactly the same, because one runner may be better at using power, so they'll use less power to run the same pace as another runner. Whereas for the GPS power derived system, you don't get that, because it can only be based on speed and elevation. It can't be based on any accelerations, whereas the Stride foot pod and any other foot pod uses accelerations in kind of 3 different planes and calculates power from that. So it's an important distinction to make. The Coros power actually aligns very well with Stride power. The numbers are actually very, very similar. But if you have any kind of poor GPS signals, and if there's any kind of different variations in power due to your running biomechanics, you won't see that at all. Whereas the FootPod's obviously far, far better, which is why I tend to recommend Stride. The other problem with the GPS ones and the Garmin, they've got a FootPod and they've got a chest strap as well. It's quite bouncy, like the data jumps up quite a lot. So it's difficult to pace yourself by, because if you've got a number, particularly Garmin, because Garmin power figures are quite a lot higher. So Stride power figures, you might be 200, 220 watts, whereas Garmin might be 400 to 480 watts. Now, if you're running along, 1 minute's 400, next minute's 460, next minute's 420, next minute's 480, it's really hard to pace yourself by. But if you're running along and it's 205, 215, 210, okay, now we've got something we can use. So the athletes I've had that have used Garmin have all got Stride, because you just can't use it to pace yourself from. If you haven't got something that you can pace yourself with, what's the point? Like, you can do post-run analysis, but the whole point of having a power meter is to aid your training whilst you're training, not after you run. So if you're serious about power, then I think Coros is the easier way to do it, but it's not as good. And then Stride's obviously the best way to do it.
Yeah, with Garmin, it's literally the running dynamics pod, which you can run separately. It's a small bean that sized clip that sits on the back of your shorts, the small of your back, or it's integrated into those HRM Run chest straps. You're right, the power readings are quite a bit higher, but I mean, at least it's a constant number that you're referring to. So what's a number, provided it's a measurable number. I've used probably both relatively evenly. You're right, the Garmin one is a little bit more laggy, but I would say not as laggy as the Coros watches. It's certainly better than nothing. And if you were to compare it to other metrics, the PPG heart rate monitors on watches versus chest straps, there's always going to be technology that's doing a better job of it. But I think probably you're right, the FootPod is very accurate, very instant to respond. And the other beauty of it is you can force it to do your pace management when outdoors as well as indoors. So you can use it on the treadmill, or you can use it for measuring your speed when you're outdoors. So there is an added benefit for the FootPod. Is that how you use your Stride meter?
Yeah, so power's really all I use now. So when I've got my watch and I go for a run, it's time and power. It's all I have on my watch. Being a bit older, I can't look at more than about two numbers on my watch anyway. I've seen some displays which show like 10 different metrics on your watch. Like, I can't read any of that. So I want to keep it really simple. Either power and speed, power and distance, or power and times is all I have on my watch. I mean, you've got to keep in mind what we're using power for. Power is just a means of determining running intensity. That's all we're doing. Now, we've done it before with pace. Like, if any road runner will know, 4 30-minute Ks, 5 30-minute Ks, that's how they moderate their intensity. Those of you got heart rate will know, okay, you've got different heart rate zones, and that's how we moderate intensity. Power is just another means of moderating intensity. And we can argue why it's better, but it's simply a way of determining how hard you're running. And that will help govern your training sessions and your long runs and your races. The advantages it has over things like heart rate is the lag in heart rate. If you're doing an interval session, 5 by 1K, first rep's 155 heart rate, second rep's 165, third rep's 170, then it's 171, 173. So you can't really use heart rate to pace an interval session because it increases throughout. Can you use pace? Well, you can, and that's a very valid way to do for a flat. But what if you're going uphill? Then you can't really use pace unless you do the same hill every time. But as soon as you go to another hill, which has got a slightly different variation, the 6-minute Ks up your other hill doesn't correlate to 6-minute Ks up this hill because it's 7% instead of 10 or 15% instead of 12. So you can't use pace either. So if you can't use heart rate and you can't use pace, what are you left with? Well, usually we're left with RPE. How does it feel? Now, some of us have got a fairly well-developed sense of RPE, and that's a very valid way of determining your training intensities. But for a lot of people, they struggle a bit. And Kerry, you know, and Ali, you know as well, when you give a client a set of hill repeats, how often do we see the first hill is done way too hard and the last hill is kind of like, oh my God, my legs are killing me. Like, it's not meant to be that hard a session. The idea is you start a little bit conservative and you build into it. So with a power meter, we can go, right, I want you to run 280 watts, 5 by 3 minute hills. Now, whether they're running on a 6% hill or a 12% hill, or a 10% hill, it doesn't matter. It's just 280 watts. So that gives you much more flexibility in your training. It also allows you in a long run to compare how you're going throughout your run. So we know, like if you're doing a 3 or 4 hour run, we'd like to have that fairly evenly paced throughout. Like we don't want to start too hard and run slower at the end. Sometimes we might want to start easy and finish harder, but generally for most long runs, we want it fairly even. Now, if you're doing a road marathon, it's all flat road, 5-minute Ks, I can keep that for 2.5 hours, all good. Once you get onto the trails and hills, you're left with nothing. You don't really know. So with power, one of the things I look at is what were your average power in the first quarter compared to the average power in the last quarter. And we go, okay, so on the flat, you were 220 in the first quarter, you were 225 in the last quarter. Fantastic, that's great. Uphill, you were 220 in the first quarter, you're only 200 in the last quarter. You dropped 20 watts on your hills in the last quarter. That tends to suggest you were going too hard, or maybe you didn't fuel properly, maybe it got a lot hotter. There's all these things we can start to look at and determine how well we should run our long runs. Instead of just going, gee, that felt really tough. That's all we've got. We don't know. But with power with the hills, we can now look at some metrics and go, okay, you started too hard, or you didn't adjust to the conditions because you started at 15 degrees, it's 30 degrees by the time you finished. So we've got a lot more data we can look at and a lot more things we can feed back and go, okay, we need to start easier next.
Did we just drop your audio there, Andy?
Yeah, I was just wondering if my face was the same as your face. Andy,
we only
can
lost.
You hear us? Your audio's gone.
Yeah, we lost the last sentence. It was fine. I swear I didn't mute him. He's definitely unmuted. Just fixing that after a brief outage due to a microphone battery. Ali, do you have a question for Andy?
Yeah, so Andy, you've done a great job of convincing me that power is relevant and could be a really cool metric to use. So say I wanted to get started with it, where do I go?
So first of all, obviously, it's your choice of power meter, whether you go, the two best options are Coros or Stride. Coros is the cheaper one, but as I said before, it's GPS based. Stride is the best one out there. It's a market leader at the moment. So once you've got your foot pod, then you need to do something with your data. It's easy enough to collect the data. Either you've got it on your watch, it's recording on your Coros software, or it's recording in your Stride Power Center. But what do you do with it? Well, with power, you need to collect enough data to make it meaningful. In the same way that if you collect heart rate data doesn't mean anything at all. Just because you ran a run at 140 beats per minute, that doesn't mean a single thing until you put it into context. So if you're using heart rate, that context should be in relation to your threshold heart rate. Some people will use max heart rate, but I don't like using max heart rate because it doesn't change over time. So your zones will be the same. So if you're using heart rate or using speed, you do the same thing. You will know your threshold speed. And then you can determine training zones based on threshold speeds or threshold power or threshold heart rate, whatever it is. So you have to collect enough data to have that information. Now, Stride make it easy. They give you a simple little test, which is a 3-minute all-out effort and then a 10-minute all-out effort. Plug it into the numbers and it gives you your threshold. And from that, you go, okay, my threshold is 280 watts. So easy runs are 80% of my threshold. So that means my easy runs are 220 to 230 watts. Great. Now we've got something we can use. So then it comes down to, well, how else can we use those numbers? On flat runs, it's very easy because that's valid the whole time. And what I mean by that is power does change a little bit with hills. I said before that it's the same. There is a slight variation that's important to understand. What happens is that we see on some athletes that the ability to run, say, 200 watts on the flat, when they go to a hill, they can hold 220 watts for the same effort or 190 watts. So it's not always the same. Some athletes are the same. If you gave them 10 minutes absolutely flat out, they do 250 watts uphill, 250 watts flat, easy. But some athletes is more or less. So you've got to try and figure out what the differences are. And an easy way to do that is just compare sessions. Do 6 by 1K or 6x4 minutes on the flat, 6x4 minutes uphill, same kind of RPE. Okay, uphill was 20 watts higher. Right, now we know. Now we've got some basis to go, okay, the data's saying my threshold is X, therefore my easy run should be Y, or my interval should be Z, or whatever it is. But when I'm going uphill, I need to up that or decrease that by 5% or 10%. So now you've got something you can use flat and uphill. As far as analyzing that, look, you do need to have a little bit of a desire to look at numbers. I won't kid you, it's not as simple as strap the thing on your foot, plug it into the software, and the software tells you what to do. If you're a road runner, it pretty much is that, because it doesn't change whether you're flat, uphill, downhill, hiking. There's no difference. You're just running flat roads. It's pretty much the same. But if you're a trail runner, you do need to do a little bit of data analysis, but it's not that complicated at the basic entry level that you'll need to do. You will need to be able to separate your uphill from downhill, from hiking, from flat running power. Now with Coros, that's hard to do unless you kind of, go into a spreadsheet and kind of like highlight sections and take data. But with Stride, it's very, very easy. You just tag the run as trail. That'll split out your running power. Flat was 200, uphill was 220, downhill was 190, hiking was 150. Then if you don't want to use any other software, you just have to use an Excel sheet and just plug that into your Excel sheet so you keep a track. So when you go to look back on your data, as you would with heart rate or with pace, those of us who keep training journals, we like looking at this kind of stuff. We'd go back and look at, okay, in the last 4 long runs I've done, my uphill power has been 220, 225, 215. It's always around that 220 mark. My downhill power has been 190, 185, 195. So we get a picture of what that looks like in our long runs. And that helps us guide race prescription, because we can use our critical power, which is our threshold power, which is, as I said before, it's easy to determine with that simple test. We can plug it into the calculator and we go, okay, if you've got a critical power of 280, then for a 6-hour run, you should be able to hold 210 watts. Great, we've got that. Or what about uphill and downhill? Well, now we go back to our long runs and go, okay, well, for the last 4 long runs, my uphill power has been about 5% higher than my flat power. Okay, so we adjust the target to be 5% higher. So if the target was 220 flat, we then go, okay, 5% higher is 230. So our uphill power in our race for 6 hours is 230 watts. So it takes a little bit of maths, but if you like spreadsheets and you like collecting data, which you would have done for heart rate or pace anyway, it's not a big jump to use power. And the advantage of it is you get to line up for your 100K, 80K, 100-mile race with some numbers, 4 numbers. You'll get your flat power, uphill power, downhill power, and hiking power. 4 numbers is all you need. And you'll start that race knowing what kind of pace you should do. Now, we all know, like if you look at UTA or UTMB or Tarawera and you look at the results, and you and Kerry would have done this, Ellie, you look at your athletes' results throughout the race and you see what position they're in. And you know straight away, if they started at 700th and finished at 300th, they've paced it really, really well. If they started at 100th and finished at 100th, you're going to think, okay, that was pretty good. If they started at 80th and finished at 300th, well, something went wrong there. They went out too hard, they had stomach problems, they got cramps, something happened.
Yeah.
Now, when we're trying to teach our athletes, okay, what kind of pace you should go at without kind of any data, because you can't really use heart rate to a degree, you can't use pace for trail races. All you can really say is, this is the classic thing we all say, is start easy, and if it feels like it's about right, slow down a little bit more, and that's pretty much all we can do, and hope that their experience has got them through that. Well, now we can say, right, I want you to start 210, 220 watts. I don't care if that feels stupidly slow. I don't care if people are pouring past you for the first 20K, couldn't care less. Because we know that if you go faster than that, you're running faster than, say, your 4-hour long run pace. And it's a 100-kilometer race. Unless you're elite, there's no way you can run 100 Ks faster than your 4-hour long pace. I've seen the data, it just doesn't happen. So with that little bit of work, it gives you some targets that you can apply in that first 20, 30K of your race to set the pacing right. So you can then take all that fitness you've done and make sure you have a good race, because so many things just get undone with that first 20K, the adrenaline kicks in, your fresh legs, and suddenly 5 30-minute K pace in the flat, which felt like about right in training runs, feels stupidly easy. It's like, oh, this is just too slow, just too slow. I'm tapered, I'm fresh, it's a race, I should run faster. And then 40 Ks in, the stomach gets upset, cramps happen, and you wonder what went wrong. It felt so easy at the start. Now we have something that can kind of guide athletes in determining, okay, that wasn't so easy. And, when you've seen enough race starters I have, I've probably looked at more than 1,000 power files of races. And when a client says they've had cramp or stomach upsets, 99 times out of 100, it's because they went too hard at the start. Like, it's such a common pattern. And it makes sense. Like, if you go too hard at the start, your stomach starts to struggle, and muscles start to struggle, you get cramp. So it just gives us that tool. And yes, it's a little bit more work, but for the reward you get from it, I think it's worthwhile. Having said that, some people just aren't into numbers. Some people, that takes away the joy of running, and that's cool. I get that. And that's a decision you make. You've got this data and these metrics that will help you running, but you find that takes away the joy, that's 100% okay. But if you want something that helps you, then power can be very, very useful.
Yeah, certainly that's one of the fundamental questions as a coach that you start with an athlete is, what is it you want from the event? If there's a performance objective, then we're into spreadsheets. If there's I want to see if I can complete this objective, then perhaps this wasn't the video for you to be watching. So I do appreciate that. I think probably there is space to have a large double-sided billboard halfway up Cliff Drive that says, how many watts are you meant to be doing on Cliff Drive, and they can read it on the way up the hill, and they can read it on the way down the hill. Yeah. And I think on that, there's actually two things that you touched on there that I think are very interesting. One of them is the applicability of using a metric like power over time, and whether it's as relevant in the last 20 kilometers of, say, Tarawera as it is in the first 20 kilometers. Good and question. Then the other thing, and you've touched on it a few times, about building 4 different numbers. I know certainly from looking at my watch when I'm out for a run and say I'm doing a long run at, say, 300 watts, I notice that I go, I want to sit around 300 watts for this long run. I notice I seem to be climbing higher than 300 watts, and I'm descending much less than 300 watts. So probably the other question is, why is it those numbers are not constant? Should I not just be looking to hold the exact same number, for the entirety of the run?
I'll address that one first. That's one of the common kind of like negatives I hear about powers. Like, I thought it was meant to be one number to rule them all. And, that'd be great if it was. It'd be great if we had this one metric that no matter what we were doing, up, down, flat, hiking, whatever it was, any time of the day, anytime, any climatic conditions, just one number we could just go by. We haven't got it. It just doesn't exist. But four is not bad. And for some people, it might only be 3, because uphill and flat are the same. I often find hiking and downhill it can be very, very similar as well. So for some people, it might only be 2. The reason for the difference, hiking, the Stride team haven't really calibrated hiking to metabolic effort. The calibration between running, particularly on the flat, and the power numbers, it's been documented. It's very well calibrated between the two. The metabolic demand is very, very well calibrated. So we can be really confident with that. When it gets to uphill, though, I've just seen that there is a difference for some people. Some people are just better at running uphills, or worse for running uphills. And you've got to take that into account. I find that if the hill's kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4% gradient, it's usually, the difference is kind of like a few watts here or there. It's just negligible, so you don't have to worry about it. But once it gets to 8, 10, 12, 15%, then I can start to see some real differences creeping into athletes. You might tell them to do 6 by 4 minutes at 280, but uphill 280 just feels cruisy. Like someone like Ben Duffus, for example, his uphill power is 20, 30 watts higher than what he can do on the flat. He's just a hill monster because he just runs so much hills. So you've got to find out, first of all, if there is a difference, and then realize that and accept that in a race. Downhill, as we know, the effort is always lower downhill. Like, it always feels easier cardiovascularly running downhill, but our legs suffer in a different way going downhill. So if you tried to keep the same power running downhill as flat, cardiovascularly wise, you'll feel okay, but your legs will be pretty smashed. So you need to calibrate that as well. You need to understand that, okay, 200 watts on the flat feels comfortable, 200 watts downhill feels pretty challenging to my legs. So we need to calibrate that. And calibration is just a matter of looking at long runs, looking at what the data does, seeing that consistently your downhill power is 20 watts less. And I just want to add in that too. Some people get phased by terrain. They go, it's no good on technical terrain. No, it's not. It's useless on technical terrain, as is heart rate, as is anything else. But if you've got the ability, whilst you're descending technical terrain, to look at your watch, then I suggest that that's not the limiting factor. Usually skill is a limiting factor on technical terrain. If you're running slow enough down technical terrain, you can look at your watch and you should be running faster. Because there's anyone who's run technical terrain, it's arms out, kind of looking where you're going. You're not going slow enough to look at your watch. So technical terrain, look, it's not useful, but you wouldn't be looking at your watch even if it was useful. So it's a misnomer. And when it comes to technical terrain, if we really think about how much technical terrain is in the races that we do, like how often power wouldn't be useful. Like it's only a small percentage of a race. As you said before, Kerry, like how much is it useful in the last 20K? The first 30K of 100K is where it's most useful. After that, pretty much you've got dialed in. Like you're not going to get to 30 or 40K again, or what, I'm going to pick it up now. It feels too comfortable. I'm going to start pushing a bit harder. Like it doesn't happen. You just kind of keep going, and you gradually get slower. All the data shows that we get slower in ultras. It's how much you get slower by. So for power, what I say is at the start, power gives you a number to go under. At the end, it's a number to try and keep up to the bottom of the range. So your range might be 200 to 210 watts. And what you'll find is at the start, you might be doing 210, 215, but at the end, 195 is feeling very, very hard. So it's useful at the end for that point of view, going, okay, no, it was 210, now it's saying 180. Can I just get it back up to 185? It gives you a number to try and work with to try and motivate yourself to go a bit harder. But really the biggest use is in that first kind of third to set the pacing up, because once you've got that pacing done, your race is pretty well set up. You don't tend to stuff the pacing up in that middle third of the run. You might slow down a bit because you've gone too hard, but if you've paced it well, then that's going to go. The other thing people get worried about is, the numbers are different on trail compared to road. And yes, that's true. But if we're talking the difference between road and fire trail, the differences are small, particularly at the levels or the intensity we run at in ultras. If you're doing 5 by 1K max efforts at the track versus 5 by 1K max effort on a flat fire trail, yes, the differences will be 5, 10 watts, and that'll be enough to throw the session out. But if we're doing a 100K race, then at that slower pace, the difference is not measurable. Like, the noise of the data is more than the difference is. So you don't have to worry about that. When I run, obviously, power all the time, my usual runs incorporate road, buffed out trail, a little bit of single track, beach, soft sand, hard sand, stairs, the whole gamut of kind of trail conditions. And does power change according to conditions? Yes, it does. Hard sand, no. Trail, no. Road, all the same. Soft sand, yes, it's lower. Like, no shit, Sherlock. Of course it's going to be lower. You're running so much slower. But I get to know that. I know for me, 220, 210 watts is my kind of easy run. Soft sand, it's 160, 170. Through experience, I know that. So you can calibrate all this kind of stuff and have that calibration through repetition in your head anyway. You have to think about it. So I think those who negate power just because it's different to road are kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like, take what you can from it and use it how you can. And if you can use power to get that pacing right in the first kind of third of your ultra, it's done its job well and truly, because you can't really go wrong from there.
Absolutely. I know that I have worked with athletes back in yesteryear before power and using heart rate in a similar way to say, hey, look, you're going to be out there for like 14 hours. We know your threshold is say 165 beats. I want you to look at your watch when you're working in the first half or first third of this event. And if you are anywhere near your threshold, you've gone too hard. So use it for a ceiling, and then by, in some way retarding the intensity for that athlete, they're able to perform better in the back half. So again, I can totally understand how that's possible. Help me understand this principle, though. When we talk about, say, threshold for a heart rate, I know that I can hold, say, threshold for about, say, 70 minutes for is about as long as I can hold it for, somewhere in the vicinity of a half marathon, a little bit shorter. And at that point, it's no longer useful. But as I've seen people explain it, surely then underneath my threshold, I should be able to run forever. So the same should apply to power then. If I work out what my functional threshold power is or my critical power is in one of these apps, then anything below the curve there, that's gravy forever. I can just run that for whether it's 12 hours or 24 hours, right? Is that right or not right?
Oh, if that only that was the case. Wouldn't runs be so much fun if that were the case? No, that's definitely not right. So power, like anything, there's a decline in power the longer you go. And we can plot that. Like they've modeled power along with pace and everything else. And the power duration curve, which is just a simple plot of time versus power, and the model shows different models, like Stride use a model, Golden Cheetah use a model, WKFI use a model. There's various models around. They're all pretty similar. But what the models show us is that as power drops below threshold, the drop is less, like it kind of doesn't plateau. It's a continual drop, but the drop gets less and less and less. So, for example, the difference in power between 3 hours and 4 hours might be 10 watts. The difference in power between 14 hours and 18 hours might only be 5 watts. So you kind of think, well, what good is it then if the difference is 4 hours and it's only 5 watts? Like, how does that work? Well, it works because all the other variables go into making a runner run 14 hours or 18 hours. It's how much they run versus how much they walk. It's how fast they hike. It's how well they fuel themselves. The noise of the data is more than that 4 or 5 watts anyway. So when I work out power targets for athletes, all I need is a ballpark. And most athletes will know that. Like if you ask somebody, what do you think you can do UTA in? Oh, I've got no idea. Like, what do you really think you can do UTA in? Oh, I reckon 13 to 15 hours. That's all we need. That's close enough to give us a power target that's useful. Because the difference in going 13 hours and 15 hours is more a case of fueling, motivation, how well you've tapered, how well you hike, how much you run versus how much you hike. Because you can average, 2 runners can average exactly the same watts running, and one runner can run 14 hours and one runner can run 18 hours because the first runner ran a lot more, the second runner hiked more. Simple as that. So we don't need to get, it's not an exact science. It's part science, part art. All we need to do is get a ballpark figure of what the athlete can run, and then we can very easily give you a target that is close enough within the noise of the data that it's hard to go wrong. Like very, very rarely have I given an athlete a target in an ultra and then they've stuck to it in the first 30K, has something gone wrong. Very, very rarely. And usually it's because they were sick, before the race they had a cold or something like that that kind of threw a spanner in the works. But pretty much if I've worked out a target for them, then if they've stuck to it, then their race has gone to plan. Unless the cyclone hits or, the trails are way boggy or way muddy or, other external factors that you just can't plan for. So I think that's the beauty of it. You don't have to be exact. You just got to collect enough data to get you in the ballpark. So you don't have to be a rocket science. You don't have to be an astrophysicist with a PhD in mathematics. You just got to get in the ballpark and you'll get the results that you want.
Well, thanks for that, Andy. So earlier you touched on RPE. So do you think that RPE has a role now that we have power?
Yeah, I do. I think as much as I love power, it's not the only metric I use. RPE, I think, is still a very valuable metric. And I think the two need to link together. I think and the same goes for whether you're using heart rate or pace. I think you need to get used to RPE versus pace or RPE versus power, or whatever it is. The two feed on each other and you get to know. I mean, I know for me, if you ask me middle of a run, what's your power? I could tell you just because I know what it feels like to do. And you don't want to be a slave to your watch. You don't want to be looking at your watch every minute going, oh, it's too high. Oh, it's too low. Oh, it's about right. That takes the joy out of running. You want to use whatever metric it is, whether it's pace, power, or heart rate. You want to use it enough so that you can pretty much guess what it is. And just every now and then you would check and go, oh, it's a fraction high. And no wonder I was feeling a bit more fatigued than I should be. Let's back it off a little bit. You want to get to that point so you've got that really good understanding of the relationship between the metrics. Having said that, I think you need to pick one master and one submaster. And what I mean by that is, if you're trying to equate power zones with heart rate zones, with pace threshold zones, you're going to get horribly confused and it's going to suck the life out of your training. And I see it quite commonly when people start with power. They go, oh, what does power equate to my zone 2 heart rate threshold? Like, it doesn't. Like, don't try and do that. Like, use heart rate for a month while you've got power to collect enough data, and then give power a go for a month or two. Just forget heart rate for a month or two. You can come back to it later if you want. Use power for a month or two. Now you've got data, and see how you go. If you're trying to always relate the three, like, it just gets way too confusing. People get to, I think a lot of people think that zones are this kind of universal, kind of fixed thing that all coaches use the same, and it's all just, zone 2 is zone 2, whether you're an athlete coached by you guys or by me or by Matt Fitzgerald's 80-20 or by Jason Coop. Zone 2 is always zone 2, and it's always the same. It's not. Like, there is no kind of 100% definition of what zone 2 is without any ambiguity. They're all roughly the same, but we all have different kind of, it's +5 here, -5 there, different kind of the number of zones. Some coaches work with 8 zones, some work with 5, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you're trying to equate power zones with heart rate zones, they're using different systems to start with. And there might be 7 power zones and 5 heart rate zones. Oh, my head's about to explode. What do I do? It's like, forget it. Pick one. I think pick one and add RPE as the second one. So I would use power and RPE as my backup one. But yeah, just don't try and use heart rate and power and RPE, because it just gets horribly confusing, and you suck the joy out of your running.
I bet you, though, the experienced athletes will know, roughly, if they were running down a bit of fire trail, what pace they're doing. They'll probably know roughly what wattage they're doing, and they'll know intuitively what their RPE is. And probably they'll know 3 out of the 4 without getting into, percentage of LTHR or heart rate reserve or any of the other, overcomplicated metrics that we could throw at this. Certainly, in our experience with athletes, when they come to a sport, they're looking for something like, you tell me how hard I need to go, but they won't be able to do it by feel very well. They will rely on their watch initially. And so if they're on the road, I'm like, look, I need you to do roughly 530s. I believe that should feel like about 5 out of 10 for you. They have no idea what 5 out of 10 is. And the RPE is the skill that they build over time. And I would say that probably when we've looked at elites closely at Tarawera and UTA, they're not looking at their watch all the time to work out what their power or heart rate or pace is, but they probably know intuitively, whether this pace is sustainable at any given moment based on, what their output is and how long they can hold it for, given the distance or time remaining. Perhaps a precursory glance at an aid station to see what, how long it's taken them, whether they're in, a time standard. But certainly at the elite level, we won't see a lot of athletes living and dying by a number on their watch, right?
I was about to say, you can live and die by the sword, right? And I remember, I think it was a Science of Ultra podcast talking about the most important computer being the brain. And you probably see both, Andy. You probably see people that ignore the power and go too hard and get caught up, or people that could give a bit more. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think I try and use power to educate RPE and vice versa. So, and I think it's not the realm of just the elites. I think any experienced runner, like if you said to them, right, I want you to do 2 reps of 20 minutes. I want you to run 10 minutes out, turn around, run 10 minutes back, have a rest, do it again. And I want them to be the same pace. So I want you to run to the same point and get back in 10 minutes and do it again the second one. I want it to be as fast as you can. The experienced runners will go, okay, cool. That's it. Off they go, and they do it. Whereas most of our athletes will go, well, how hard is that meant to be? Like, what power or what pace should I run at? Like, how do I know? Like, they just haven't got the experience to know how to do that. So whether using pace or power, I mean, obviously I prefer power, but I would say to them, right, let's stick at 250 to start with, and maybe pick it up 255 for the second rep. But then again, I'll sometimes give a client a session, right, I want you to do 20 minutes. Forget power, don't look at it, just do 20 minutes hard. And just see how they are, just see how their perception of RPE and power is, because that's good feedback. Because I think if you're just trusting power and not looking at RPE and not getting a sense of how it feels, then that's a problem as well, because you need to have both, because there are limitations to power. If it's a hot day, power needs to be less. So we just can't run, as does pace, and heart rate's affected by heat differently as well. So we need to be able to moderate our intensity according to the climatic conditions on the day. Now, with power, like if I know beforehand, like my Hong Kong athletes and my athletes who live in far north Queensland, come summer, we know that their targets are 10 or 15 watts lower than what they are in winter. So we can plan for that. And if an athlete goes from, I've got an athlete who lives in Colombia, so when he trains, when he races at sea level, we can adjust power targets based on some calculations and tables to moderate that. But sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes, in Sydney, for example, it's just getting that summertime. So you might be running it in 20 degrees, but on the weekend it's 28, humid. So like if you're sticking to your watch and sticking to heart rate, pace or power, it doesn't matter. You get halfway through your long run and go, oh my God, this is killing me. So you need to recognize that. You need to recognize through your RPE and go, this feels harder than it should. Even though power's right, it feels harder. So it's hotter. It should be a bit lower. So I really think it's important to calibrate whatever metric you use with your RPE and get good at both. So if one is taken away, then you've still got the other one. Otherwise, I just think you're not going to perform optimally, and you're going to have the ability to respond in both training and races to the different challenges in terms of climate and elevation and other factors that often come our way.
Yeah, the brain's the real supercomputer, eh? I wish we had more of it. I just wanted to double check where you live. I suspect there's an anti-vax protest going on right now, Andy. Just double checking our questions that we had in the Trail and Ultra Coaches Corner for you. I believe you've answered many of them very well. Ben had asked if there was any way to calculate or a formula to calculate your potential race power. How do you work out how much power an athlete should be preparing to target?
There's a good online calculator called the Superpower Calculator. If you just type in Superpower Calculator into Google, it'll come up. Then you'll need to input your critical power, estimated race duration. And as I said, you don't need to be that accurate. The shorter the race, the more accurate you need to be. Like if you're running a 10K, whether you put in 40 or 45 minutes makes a big difference.
Oh yeah.
But if you're running 100K, whether you put in 12 hours or 13 hours makes, like as I said before, the difference is less than the noise of the data when you're running along anyway. The other thing you will need is what they call a fatigue factor or a regal factor. And for ultras, minus 0.11 is just the standard, and it works pretty well, unless you're particularly elite or maybe it's kind of 50K. So with those three numbers, with the minus 0.11, your critical power and your estimated race time, you'll get a good figure. Now, obviously, if you've got other races, you can use other race data. So if you've done a 50K on trails and you've got that data, then you can use that, which will be even more accurate than your critical power, because presuming the race went well. Like if you had a race where you started out too hard and blew up, don't use that data, because it's, you're basing another race on a race that didn't go well. That's never going to end well. So if you've got a race that you've already done and you think, okay, I used power for that race, it went really well, that's another check. And what you'll find is that if you've got an accurate critical power and you've got good data for a race that went well, using either of those will give you approximately the same number, which is obviously, okay, great. My critical power is saying 220 watts. My race is saying 218 watts. That's close enough for me. That's all you need. If there's a difference, it either means your critical power is not accurate or the race data is not accurate. Now, I will clarify, if you're using that calculator, you have to use flat run power, not average power. That's something that people kind of like don't quite understand. Your average power for a trail race will include the uphill, the downhill, and the hiking. And that number is not going to be relevant to any of those numbers. So you might run 220, uphill's 230, hiking's 170, downhill's 190, and the average is 200. Well, 200 is not good for any of those. It's just the number in between. It's completely useless. So when you use a race calculator, when you use the calculator and you want to determine a race power based on a previous race, you need to input your flat run power or your uphill power. So you need to have the split of how that power was kind of distributed in that race. The only way to get that without a fancy program is through Stride, because Stride will split that up for you automatically based on the criteria that I gave them. If you haven't got Stride, then it's more difficult to do. You need to use WKO or Gold Cheetah or something like that. But if you're using Stride, you just tag the race trail, and then it will split out uphill, flat, hiking, and downhill. So that's how you calculate it. And you can I usually validate it with your long runs. I usually look at kind of like critical power, previous race power, long run power, and get a real sense that, okay, I'm pretty confident with this. If you do the sums and the sum came out for a 100K race to be 20 watts higher than a 5-hour long run, and you start scratching your head and going, that doesn't seem right. Some data's wrong here somewhere, because obviously you're not going to run a 100K race 20 watts higher than what you can run a 5-hour long run at. It just doesn't happen. So you need to look at the data there. But generally speaking, if you've got some good data from long runs, an accurate critical power, and previous race data, you can get very, very good race approximation targets.
Good one. Okay, the last question I think we haven't covered was someone was asking about WKO5, which is the, or maybe just briefly talk about what WKO is and how it can be used. Someone was talking about using the app or software to help them with their own training. How is it applicable?
Yeah, so I use WKFI primarily because it allows me to customize all the data I want to see. Apps like Training Peaks or Strava or Stride or Garmin, or wherever they are, you've got a set amount of charts and data you can look at. Now, they define them, you just look at them. Whereas with WKO, I can create my own charts. So I can create charts that tell me how much vert per 10K, what their power was split up into up, down, flat, etc. So for me, it means I can fine tune my analysis of the data very, very easily. So if a client wants to know, what their average uphill power was over the last 90 days, I can tell them. If they want to know what's the average power between a 1 to 2 hour run versus a 3 to 4 hour run, I can tell them. It does take a bit of knowledge. It's a bit of a learning curve. So you need to be prepared to play with data a bit. It takes some elementary programming skills. Although for those that are interested, if they contact me, I can give them some basic charts, which will take that away from them to get them started. But you need to kind of have the curiosity to kind of explore further. You don't need WKO to use power at all. You probably, for trail runners, you probably do need to use Stride though. And the reason I say that is Stride is the only platform that will split up your power into uphill, downhill, flat, and hiking. No other platform will do that. And without that, it's difficult to kind of get enough accurate data to use on trails and ultras. So whilst Coros power is fairly equivalent to Stride power, Coros don't split that data up in their analysis. So if you've got, your typical training run is flat, up a big climb, down a big climb, flat again, then it's pretty easy just to select the climbs. Just kind of fine tune your cursors and select the data for that. That's fine. You can probably get good data from it. But if your trail runs are up and down all over the place, then it's just too hard. You're just not going to get good data. So you need to use something like Stride so you can get the accurate split of power over the different terrains.
Yeah, gotcha. That's a lot of good info on power, Andy. It's really appreciated. I'm sure you'll have a few more people that are contemplating getting into Stride and using power as one of their preferred metrics.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy.
Awesome.
I tried to keep this to under an hour, so super informative as always. I look forward to the next Mile27 podcast. No doubt there'll be one on the values of bucketing all of your training into zones, and no doubt one on power and the ability to apply different metrics to RPE and calculate your race pace.
Definitely.
I have shared your Superpower Calculator to Ben, who asked that question, and I will download this, upload it to YouTube, and share it with those in the Trail and Ultra Coaches Corner. And if people want to get in touch with you, it's pretty easy. You can just ping Andy at Mile27. Is that the best way?
Yep, mile27.com.au.
So good. Thank you so much for your time, Andy. Have a great day.
Great talk.
Cheers.
You too.